5, 4, 3.
I'm Mark Trahant, and this is Wassaja. A Cherokee attorney, Mary Kathryn Nagle, recalls clerking for a federal judge when she learned the history behind an important legal case. So she asked, "Why did I not know that?" Why did I not know that is a theme, one of invisibility that runs through America's knowledge about its own history. There are so many ways we learn about ourselves: through schools, through stories, through the law, or music and film. Mary Kathryn Nagle tells a different story. She's filling in those gaps about what we do not know. She writes legal briefs, she teaches young people about the value of words, and she writes plays that are being produced on both coasts. I've been lucky enough to have been in the audience for several of Mary Kathryn Nagle's plays. The stories she tells are those that we need in our canon, our shared memory. America's history should start thousands of years ago, not a couple of hundred years back. Take just one, the story of the urban Americas. The cities in the Americas were larger and more sophisticated than those in Europe. Yet we think of Paris instead of Cahokia. At the time of the American Revolution, the Mandan villages, now known as Double Ditch, were larger than most of the colonial cities on the East Coast. This thread of history is essential to understanding. Nagle's success on the stage gives me hope that we could get past our knowledge gap. When I saw the play Sovereignty in Washington, D.C., I overheard a couple in the next row remark about how sovereignty is a living, modern concept. Perfect.
Set my house on fire, kill someone, basically do whatever you want. Cherokee Nation could never prosecute you.
Take their land, take the jurisdiction.
Never in a million years did I think we would hear an American president recognize the inherent right of our nations to protect our own citizens.
If we agree to move west, we will lose our lands, but we will preserve the nation.
I can't arrest a non-native who attacks a native.
I know the slap you get for speaking your language, when someone's laughing at you because of who you are.
My name is Mary Kathryn Nagle. I am an attorney and a playwright. I'm a partner at a law firm called Pipestem Law, and I'm a citizen of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma.
And you have a very connected family to the name of this show.
Yes. In fact, I am a direct descendant of John Ridge. He was my grandmother's great-grandfather, and of course his first cousin was Elias Boudinot, who started the Cherokee Phoenix, and that's my family. I just, as you know, finished writing a play that got produced where they're all characters, so it's their story really through the 1820s and 30s, around the time when the Cherokee Phoenix was first created. And part of the research I did for the play was to go back and read a lot of their writings. And you know, so much of what I've heard growing up from my grandmother was oral history, and she would talk a lot about what they did, and of course I fell in love with my own grandfathers because, you know, how could you not when your grandmother tells you these stories? But then reading their actual writing they're amazing writers. And John Ross too. I mean, you think about these Cherokee men at this time, Elias Boudinot, John Ross, John Ridge, and these are some of the best advocates for tribal sovereignty, maybe in the history of the United States.
One of the things that intrigued me about Mary Kathryn Nagle's play was how she was able to bridge the divisions between the Ridges and the Rosses. She found common ground for two really compelling stories.
1828. Chief John Ross, Major Ridge, and John Ridge prepare to meet with the president.
Well, look at this. The Major here in Washington. Have you come to see me?
Hello, General.
I love this man. I really, truly love this man.
President Jackson.
Oh, sounds good, doesn't it? And don't tell me this must be
John Ross. I serve as Chief of Cherokee Nation.
Oh, nothing but the official delegation for me, eh?
John Ridge, I serve as the assistant to my father, the speaker of our Cherokee Nation Tribal Council.
We're so pleased to hear that you won the election.
I can't thank you enough for your support.
We were happy to give it.
You know, I really, in writing the play, wanted to deal with that division and go straight into the heart of it, and so not hide it. And as a Ridge descendant, I was able to find a couple other Ross descendants who would agree to read the play for me, and I asked them, I said, please tell me. I have an inherent bias, you know, and I grew up, certain members of my family would be upset if they saw this play because they would feel like I'm making John Ross a hero and he's a villain to them. Whereas I know a lot of people at Cherokee Nation villainize the Ridges. I mean, the characters on stage debate, fight, name call. I mean, they do all the things that our family members still do to this day. But ultimately, I hope that the John Ross and John Ridge descendants who come and see this play and have seen this play will find healing and will find that we actually have a lot more in common. And that really this is a story of two really important Cherokee families, very smart and dedicated Cherokee families who were doing everything they could to save Cherokee Nation, and it was the outside forces that drew a wedge between them. And that's, you know, if there's any villain, it's Andrew Jackson and the entire United States government that allowed that to happen. Which is the crazy thing too about this play is that I started writing it in 2015. Andrew Jackson was a character from the beginning because, you know, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, Major Ridge, fought with him. That's how he got his name Major. Andrew Jackson gave him that title. So Andrew Jackson's been sort of a family character in my family for my whole life because he's a part of our family oral history and our stories. And Andrew Jackson's a pretty well-known president, but he's not someone that's commonly brought up in, you know, contemporary conversation in terms of American presidents. So then to just go from me writing this play and he's a character to all of a sudden Donald Trump getting elected, and then boom, his portrait is being hung in the White House, and the whole incident with the Navajo code talkers. And that happened right before we went into rehearsals for my play. And so then all of a sudden that happened, and all of a sudden we're in DC rehearsing this play where there's an actor on stage playing Andrew Jackson. And it was somewhat surreal. Some of our most liberal theater institutions were saying, how is it that this country could elect Donald Trump when just several years before the election, they were taking a play to Broadway called Bloody Bloody Andrew Jackson that celebrated Andrew Jackson as a sexy rock star who wore tight jeans and sang and danced, and they put Native people as red face on stage. They had white actors with red paint, fake feathers, and they did lots of really offensive things like grunt. They spoke incoherently on stage, and then they sang a song called 10 Little Indian, how 10 Little Indians die, you know, then there were 10, it's a horrible song. I can't even remember how the words because I've like blocked it from my mind. So they're putting this musical out which celebrates Andrew Jackson. And they're white and liberal and lovely and all these things, but then here we are, and they're like, how is it that our culture just elected Donald Trump? It's like, you're the ones celebrating his idol. The person whose values he's drawing upon to win this election. You're celebrating that person in the art you're making and dehumanizing us.
You know I gave him his name.
The state of Georgia lays claim to our lands, and federal agents in our midst have begun to play foul.
You fear you will lose your land?
The state of Georgia is attempting to take it from us.
Unlawfully, with violence and fraud.
Well, I understand several tribes are negotiating treaties to sell their lands and move west.
We will never leave our lands.
The Choctaw just signed a treaty. They're moving west.
We're not the Choctaw.
And the Chickasaw.
We're Cherokee Nation. We're not moving.
I think, you know, in hindsight, you can debate back and forth, but the point is they were convinced that the only way to save the sovereignty of Cherokee Nation and to perpetuate the nation, the existence of the nation, was to move the nation. Otherwise, the nation would be consumed by the state of Georgia, the state of Tennessee, all, you know, the United States government. And John Ross and people who are descended from him should speak for him, not me, but what I see in his writings, and I tried to dig in and read his writings. I went through the John Ross papers at the Gilcrease Museum, an amazing collection they have there of a lot of his original writings from that time. Was, you know, our land is what makes us who we are. We're Cherokee because we come from this land. How can we separate ourselves from it? And so, You know, what I'm also interested in is how this debate, this struggle, is not just a Cherokee struggle, but you can find it within the Great Sioux Nation. You can find it, the Ponca tribe has a similar story. I mean, every tribe has this moment where one leader said, actually, the only way we're gonna survive is if we agree they want us to move over here, we should do that. And another leader said, no, absolutely not. We'll die defending our lands. And then, of course, unfortunately, I think oftentimes, then we end up fighting each other. And I think we're living with the remnants of that today. I think a lot of people look at tribal governments and say, oh, they're so dysfunctional. Well, that's because we haven't healed the trauma from the 1700s and 1800s and 1900s that got us to where we are today. All of that outside force that then forced us to go inward and fight ourselves because we had differing opinions about how we should react to the threats to our existence.
It's one thing for Mary Kathryn Nagle to talk about how active she is in the theater, but she's also an extraordinarily active lawyer.
You know, some of the work that is the most meaningful to me is the work that we do representing tribal courts. Some tribes we're working with to reestablish their courts. You know, a lot of our tribal nations had their courts taken away from them around the time of statehood when Oklahoma was becoming a state, and it was kind of forced upon us, and our courts were made illegal. So we're working with some tribes to get their courts back. We also are currently representing the Creek Nation Court in a case where their sovereignty, their inherent right to adjudicate a dispute that arises on their land regarding tribal citizens. That's an alarming trend of this, you know, trying to circumvent the tribal exhaustion doctrine and prevent tribal courts from exercising their jurisdiction over disputes that arise on tribal lands. And so that's, to me, some of the most important work we do is preserving tribal sovereignty and tribal jurisdiction and protecting it. And we also represent the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center, which is a nonprofit working to end domestic violence and sexual assault against Native women. And, you know, and now we're having conversations about the Murphy case. And that's a very serious case because, again, the Creek Nation's reservation has never been established. It is a reservation created by treaty, which we know in the United States Constitution that treaties signed by the President and ratified by the Senate are the supreme law of the land. And the Supreme Court has said that, you know, reservations can only be disestablished by Congress. Now we can all debate the legitimacy of that doctrine too, right? Where does Congress get their authority to disestablish reservations that are established by treaty? But at the same time, no Supreme Court case has held that a state can disestablish a reservation. And the state of Oklahoma is trying to argue that basically its birth into statehood effectuated a disestablishment of the Creek Nation reservation. And so that case is going up to the Supreme Court now, and I think all eyes will be on that case because it could have serious implications for all of Indian country. I remember when I decided to go to law school and I thought, you know, I love playwriting. I wrote my first play as a college student, but I'm never gonna make it as a playwright. And I knew I wanted to be a lawyer. And my grandma grew up telling me stories about how John Ridge was the first Native attorney, because of course, he studied to be an attorney in the 1820s. Back then, no federal or state court would allow a Native person to practice and to actually enter an appearance in court and speak on behalf of a client. But so he worked closely with Principal Chief John Ross on Worcester v. Georgia. So I knew I wanted to be an attorney. There was no question about that. I just felt slightly heartbroken that I felt like I was giving up on my dream of being a playwright. But I was, you know, stood strong in my convictions. I was going to be an attorney. Well, the third week after I moved to New Orleans to start law school at Tulane, Hurricane Katrina hit. And that was, as you can imagine, pretty disruptive. And I actually relocated to DC because I'd been doing my undergrad studies there at Georgetown, so it just made sense to go back to where I had just left. Long story short, I started talking to different professors and members of the Tulane law community, and people were traumatized. Some people had lost everything they owned. Most of our community was fine compared to other communities in the New Orleans area that were completely obliterated, but people were traumatized. And I met with one of the professors there who had relocated at Georgetown Law for the semester. And we were just having lunch one day, and he said, I don't know how we're going to get students to come back to class because people are just not even going to be able to focus. You know, some of them are not going to have electricity or running water for a while. So that's how the bad situation was in New Orleans. And I said, well, we should do a play. And And of course, this professor thought, what play would we do? And I said, well, I would write one. And he was like, that sounds kind of crazy. So he called the dean, and the dean was like, that sounds kind of crazy. But if this, first year student wants to write a play, tell her she has my blessing. So he emailed me, he's like, the dean says you have his blessing. And I was like, great. So I just called a bunch of people, faculty, alumni, staff, students, and interviewed them about their Katrina experience, created a play based off those stories, and then we got back, convinced faculty and students to act in it. So one of our first weeks back, we got into the theater, it was basically a classroom, at the law school, and performed it. And it went really well. I mean, people were crying, they were really impacted, and again, I think people just needed a space to process what had just happened and the trauma and to grieve, and so we did that, and we did it collectively, and it had such an impact on everyone that they kind of turned to me and they said, well, what play are you going to write next year? And I thought, oh, okay, cool. So I wrote a play next year, and we produced it. Students, we had rehearsals 6 nights a week. We memorized it. We had a little bit of a set and costumes. It was awesome. And we did that my 3rd year. I did another play. And then I graduated, and I went to clerk at the Federal District Courthouse in Omaha, Nebraska. And again, I kind of felt like, okay, I'm saying goodbye to playwriting because now I'm going to be a real attorney. Of course, I'm clerking for a federal judge, so I'm not really litigating, but goodbye, dream of being a playwright, because again, I'm not going to have this community of my fellow law students who were so gracious and being willing to do whatever the heck I put together. It's like, what is this? Okay, we'll do it. I still at that point had not worked with a professional theater company. And one of the first days on the job there, the federal judge I clerked for, Judge Battalion, walked into my office and he said, Mary Kathryn, your assignment is to create a historical display in the lobby of the courthouse that will commemorate an important decision this court has made. And I was, of course, very intimidated with that because I'm not a visual artist. And I was like, how am I going to, I can't curate a museum display. But I started researching, and that's when I found the decision about Chief Standing Bear from 1879, when Judge Dundee declared Indians to be persons under the law. And of course, there was a very prominent journalist involved in that story, Thomas Henry Tibbles, who at that time was writing for the Omaha Herald. And, I became mesmerized with the story. I also didn't understand why I didn't learn about it. As someone born and raised in Oklahoma, also grew up in Missouri and Kansas, but being from Oklahoma, Chief Standing Bear, Ponca Tribe, Oklahoma, they're also in Nebraska, but again, it's like, how do I not know about this in Oklahoma? And then why didn't I read about this case in law school? So I go back to the judge and I said, I just realized that the 130th anniversary is this May. We should do a theatrical reenactment of the trial in the courthouse on the anniversary. And he's like, you mean like a play? And I was like, exactly. And he's like, well, what play would we do? And I was like, I'll write one. And he's like, that sounds crazy. And he was like, but if you put a script on my desk by January 1st and I can read it and it's not horrible, then sure. But I don't think he thought I was going to do it. So January 1st, I walked in after the holiday break and put it on his desk, and he was like, you really did this? And I was like, yes, I did. So, and that play, we took to the museum in DC.
First play I saw.
Yeah, so, that was sort of that opened many doors for me. You never know what life will lead you, because we took it to the museum, and we also took it to the Smithsonian Museum of American Indian, and someone there saw it and sent it along to someone at the Public Theater in New York, because they had a Native Theater initiative at the time. And then at that point, I had finished clerking and had taken a job with a corporate law firm in New York. I had tried to get an Indian law job, but you never know where life will lead you. And a lot of our Indian law firms aren't always hiring a class of 20 every year. And, certainly like NARF and NCAI aren't always hiring. And so I took a job in New York just to have one, and ended up at a very nice, prestigious law firm in New York, which I didn't think I would be in life. But then that allowed me to take this internship, sort of fellowship, with a theater in New York called the Public Theater. And they got my script and asked me to apply to this program because someone at NMAI had recommended it after they saw Wassaja, which is the play about Chief Standing Bears.
Hearing Kathryn Nagle's story is not just about her work in the theater, but also her commitment to young people and the students at Yale.
It's been such a blessing to, Ned Blackhawk is a professor there of history at Yale, Western Shoshone, and he got funding from the university to create an Indigenous Performing Arts program, and then the university asked me to be the executive producer of it. And it's the biggest blessing ever, because I have a pool of money to do sort of whatever I want with. And So we've been able to do a national youth Native playwriting contest. So for everyone out there, if you're 25 or younger and you're writing a play, or if you're 25 and younger, write your first play. And we put out the call for submissions in like August or September usually. We were always a little bit behind, but this deadline is usually by the end of December. And then we have a national panel of judges that reads the applicants, and then we fly the winner out to workshop their play with a professional dramaturg, director, and professional Native actors. And I have to say, we've gotten some really talented young writers who are also having their first time hearing their play out loud. And I think for a lot of people who don't necessarily work in the theater, they don't understand the power of that. So I love that we can give that opportunity to people who would otherwise not get it. I know for me, some of the most formative experiences I've had as a writer were my first 2 productions were with Native theater companies, Merenda in New York and Native Voices at the Autry in LA. If I hadn't had those experiences, I know I wouldn't be where I am today as a writer. And no other mainstream theater was going to take a risk on an unproduced, very raw talent like me, but those 2 theaters gave me a chance to kind of at least fine-tune my craft enough that I could get myself to a level where these other theaters would consider me.
Well, and like Yale, the Autry's investing in talent in a way that's really extraordinary.
Very extraordinary. And when you look at the list of Native playwrights they've produced, I mean, it's probably 30 or 40 at this point. It's a lot. And so when theaters say, because I have this conversation with theaters all the time, oh, hello, hi, nice to meet you. I'm so excited. What are some Native playwrights you've produced? And get this like deer in the headlights look, and then they have this realization they've never produced a single Native playwright, not one. And so then I'll talk to them and say, okay, well, gosh, what can we do to help solve this problem? Because you know what, our Native playwrights are just as talented and as worthy of production on the American stage as white playwrights and black playwrights and Hispanic playwrights and LGBTQ playwrights and every other underrepresented community in general. We all have talented writers. We all should be on the American stage. They always come back to me with, well, we just don't know any Native writers. And it's like, okay, you may not know any, but that's your fault, because Native Voices at the Autry is very loud and proud. But the wonderful thing right now is that we have more Native playwrights getting produced and workshopped right now in June than I think ever before in the history of the United States. There's more work for Native actors all of a sudden because Native playwrights are actually getting produced and workshopped. Which is, again, it's just such an exciting time, and just to honor and recognize that so many Native theater artists have worked so hard for decades to get us to this point, to kind of break that glass ceiling, like Spider-Woman Theater and Diane Glancy and Bill Yellowrobe, and we wouldn't, but now here we are at this moment where, instead of having to just kind of keep hitting our heads against the wall, we're the generation that actually gets the opportunities that have been in the making for so many years. We've got theaters right now doing full productions of Native plays. And that's what we need in Hollywood, in film and TV, because again, these are art forms that when you read them on the page, and especially when it's Native characters who are authentically portrayed, you've got white or other ethnicities that are not Native reading these scripts. They're not familiar with the culture or the community or the lingo or the rhythm of dialogue or anything. And so I actually question, how do they judge whether it's good writing or not? Because I've been on a few panels recently, and I'm like the only Native person on a panel, and you hear how other people talk about the Native writing in the mix, and you realize that they don't have the vocabulary to even to enter the conversation. And so our Native writers are being judged and critiqued by people who literally don't understand the narrative and have no experience with it. And you're not going to until you see the full product. So, I think reading my play, Sovereignty, is very different than seeing it, because then you're seeing Native actors be Native people on stage. And so it was just interesting to me to talk to some of the theater artists from around the country who had read the script, and then after they came and saw it, the different angles they had on the play. I've been asked to consult on shows where they don't want to hire a Native writer in the room, but they want to do a Native episode. And so you pick the genre. It could be, a white sheriff detective story. It could be a white president and the tribe shows up to protest in front of the White House. Or you name the genre where all of a sudden they want to do a spicy Native episode. And a lot of this is post-Standing Rock, so there's a lot of appetite, as Hollywood would say, for Native stories. So when you read those scripts, and they are just based on stereotypes, it's like, how much can you move it forward? And what can you do? And so I try to challenge, well, you know, this tribe doesn't exist. Why don't you write the episode about a tribe that really does exist? Because this will probably perpetuate the myth that we're not real, you know? Because your characters are not from a fake tribe. We have 573 very real tribes. We just need content written by natives because then we won't have to fight all the stereotypes that are just entrenched in the script. Show business is risky business. Nothing's really guaranteed until it's all done and done. But I think once these stories actually get fully produced and the money is being committed for their production, I think then we'll really see the amplification because our stories are powerful and we have really talented writers. And so I'm very confident that once we get through that access point, it'll be successful.
That story, that we are still here and not invisible, is so important and powerful. As Nagle pointed out, there remains so many more stories to tell. There are dozens of talented Native playwrights that only need an audience, or Native authors that need a publisher, or Native filmmakers that need a studio. We need to hear these stories. We need to make sure that the next generation hears a story and then says, I've heard that one before. It's a great story. I'm Mark Trahant, and this is Wassaja.
Pack your bags and the memories, not nobody tell you otherwise, till they see the world through your eyes.